couple of the things I took in were discussions using the term academic segregation, Masterman High School, which is where one of my dear friends and colleagues went to high school herself about 30 years ago, and one of my master's students actually got pulled over as a very tall African-American teenager and got out of the ticket when the police officer saw his Masterman ID. It's something that's caught my attention for a long time. Right now they've got 17% of their students are black in a city where 48% of the students are black, and 5% Latinx students in a city with 22% Latinx enrollment. So thinking about these issues alongside the strains of incoming quality high school admissions in Chicago. And what I hope is that we'll see sort of what light it might shed on what's happening here in Philly. So knowing what you guys know, I'll be talking about competitive choice, where people get to pick which schools they apply to, but where the schools ultimately get to decide who gets to attend them. Here in Philly, the schools actually decide. In Chicago, it's decided by an office that's external to the schools. The schools have no say in who attends them. It's all done by a sort of algorithm, because there's been so much cheating and cronyism as there is in Chicago. So I'm going to share students' words and experiences, and I want to lead you in with what I concluded, that competitive public school choice policy requires students to compete to access essential public educational resources in cities where the playing field is now level, during a time when educational attainment matters more than ever to young people's academic and economic futures, and in an age where young people are developmentally vulnerable to the impact of educational competition. So under these circumstances, competitive choice reinforces and exacerbates existing social inequalities at a really pivotal point in young people's lives. Even the winners, the people who get into the schools that they wanted to attend, don't come out feeling like they won as much as that they survived. So what I want to do is share three aspects of the book: how competitive choice happens at this developmentally pivotal point in young people's lives and what that means, how competitive choice ends up reinforcing social inequalities and exacerbating them, and then how competitive choice encourages young people to take actions to protect themselves in the middle of this really stressful experience. All the schools I'm going to talk, now I guess here I can just say the school names because you guys wouldn't care about them. In Chicago I don't do that, and I don't do it in the book because I feel like a lot of schools have reputations that they didn't really earn, whether those are negative reputations or positive reputations. And I don't want to sort of jump on that pile, and likewise all the young people and educators' names are city names also. So the first one is the pivotal point of adolescence. So let me see here. Okay, so competitive choice policy doesn't just happen to any young people. It happens to early adolescents, 8th grade students who are typically 13 or 14 years old. While development at any age is informed by culture, social status, gender, and living conditions, to name a few things, there are nonetheless developmental characteristics that U.S. youth of this age tend to share. They're deeply engaged in substantial transitions in how their brains work, how they see themselves, and how they relate to others around them. Largely because of where participants were developmentally, they found the high school application process cognitively overwhelming yet urgently meaningful. Most applied to multiple schools and school types. To do so demanded much in terms of their organization and planning. In other, more developmental, fancy-sounding words, executive functioning, understood as the ability to problem solve, plan ahead, and coordinate thoughts and behavior, an ability that most adolescents don't fully master at the end of adolescence. Until the end of adolescence, if then. Hold that thought and think about Ina, who moved to Chicago just before 8th grade. She applied to 11 high schools. These included academically selective schools that required an entrance exam along with grades and test scores, some of which she just didn't have as an out-of-state transfer student. Performing arts schools that demanded auditions, schools that required essays or interviews, schools that used their own homespun entrance exams, and schools that admitted students by lottery. Students had to keep in mind multiple application-specific requirements like eligibility standards to even apply, procedures for submitting required materials, procedures for registering for entrance exams, interviews, or auditions, and deadlines or dates for all of those things. Some, but not all, schools required attendance at scheduled open houses for admission, most of which happened only once per year. On top of all that, every private school had its own deadlines and requirements. All these provisions laid out a bewildering menu of tasks that students had to remember, sequence, coordinate, and execute. Raphael's session with Ms. Richmond, his counselor, illustrates the confusion that could follow. Have you signed up for the test, the entrance exam, Ms. Richmond asked. Raphael said he did something involving selective enrollment schools and something about Edmonds High School. Ms. Richmond asked if he'd done the International Baccalaureate or IB application for Edmonds, which was an online application. I'm not sure, it was before they let you apply, Raphael answered. What schools are you interested in, she asked. Condor Honors, Condor Arts, Raphael replied. You can download the PDF application. Keep talking, Raphael. Perry, Edmonds Finds Arts Program. Good. St. Michael's, a private school, he added. Did you sign up for their shadow day? Not yet. Okay, Ms. Richmond continued. So, you're going to apply to Condor Arts and Edmonds Fine Arts. How about Condor IB? No, Condor Honors, Raphael corrected her. Are you eligible to apply to Condor's IB? She asked. Raphael nodded yes. Okay, well, you might as well apply, Ms. Richmond suggested. If you're comfortable going to those schools, you may as well apply to different programs at them. Condor would ultimately require Raphael to submit 3 different applications, both paper and online, to its separate programs. After a pause, she said, have you looked at Fine Arts Academy, which is a public performing arts school? Not yet. Here's the deal. What they want is an online application. They don't want to sift through paper. It's due earlier on December 6th, and you have to do an audition. Acting and musical theater is combined. Talk to Mr. Iyari about that. Raphael was pretty organized. He also had home internet, computer, and printer access. He nevertheless faced the staggering volume of application requirements. Other people stumbled over issues like missing standardized test scores, conflicts between published information and informal knowledge, about high schools, and not knowing their full home address, all of which mattered to completing applications successfully. High school admissions was also deeply meaningful to students' evolving identities. It got at what a lot of us catch ourselves thinking and saying, and then thinking, oh, it's terrible, I think that, of students who attend different schools. So this is also from chapter 4 of the book. Students attached academic identities to themselves and to others by the kinds of schools that they went to. They avoided stigmatized schools and sought schools that had students like those they wanted to be and be seen as. Both students who were eligible and ineligible to test for the academically selective schools in Chicago overwhelmingly described kids at those schools with more positive terms, calling them, for example, high standard kids, good people, the best students, and my favorite, the future movers and shakers of society. 2/3 of the people we interviewed saw such students as intelligent, but only 2 out of the 36 we talked to saw kids who attended open enrollment neighborhood schools as intelligent. 87.5% of the selective enrollment test-eligible participants, and 1/3 of the people who weren't eligible to take that test, talked of students in neighborhood schools in disparaging terms, using words like lazy, mediocre, hoodlums, people who fight and smoke, and what Joseph said most distressingly, dumpster kids. Even though she was new to Chicago, Ina already drew this connection. It makes you seem not smart, she told me, to go to Jewel, because it's a neighborhood school, sort of what you were talking about, Kathleen. So, oh, no, I did cut something off, so I'm just going to have to ad-lib, which is very good for me. So this whole developmentally loaded, identity-linked process wasn't just happening in some neutral space where the schools were every 10 blocks and the whole city was exactly even. It's Chicago, known historically, known contemporarily for racial and economic segregation. And known for the uneven distribution of educational resources that led to the walkouts in the 1960s and hasn't changed a whole lot since then. So students were sharp to this. They knew that different schools had different resources. They also, regardless of their identities, avoided schools, including really high-performing schools, in neighborhoods that were socially and racially marginalized. And this is one of the big surprises for me of the findings. There are excellent schools throughout the city. There are schools that are historically recognized as high-achieving schools that have graduated notable artists and intellectuals across the city. The young people in my study who were situated pretty close to the center of the city and could have gotten almost any place in the city on the excellent transportation they had access to, avoided schools on Chicago's south and west sides, which are predominantly Black and brown communities, which was a huge surprise to me. So from chapter 3, where I talk about all this. When admissions letters arrived at students' homes, Uday learned that 2 schools with comparable online reviews, performance records, and public transportation commute times from his home had let him in. One was Madsen, a nationally ranked academically selective school located in a South Side neighborhood that a local television news program had recently named one of Chicago's most dangerous. Hillside's International Baccalaureate, or IB, program also let him in. That school stood in a disproportionately white neighborhood, 80% white residents in a city that at the time was 32% white, which received little media attention for any reason other than perhaps its annual Irish parade. Uday struggled to choose between these 2 schools. His parents did not struggle, though. He told me, they found out Hillside's in a white neighborhood, so it's supposed to be safe. They said it was fine, like you could go there. They never told Uday not to attend Madsen. All the same, they were kind of like shaky, he told me. They were nervous about it. Mr. Menk, Uday's science teacher, had mentioned Hillside frequently and talking with students. Hi, come on in. He didn't say it directly because, teachers don't say that kind of thing. But in a way, he said, go to Hillside. Uday got the message, and that's where he went. So the next year, I saw Uday at a grocery store cafe to find out how things were going for him. What he told me was that beginning his commute around 6:30 a.m. every day, he took a bus and then a train and then a hefty walk to Hillside High School. It took over an hour each way to get there. The long commute had led him to consider transferring, but he found his alternatives unappealing. If I can't manage, I guess I'll go to Edmonds, he said of his neighborhood high school, also in a predominantly white neighborhood. To an extent, Chicago's racial geography even dictated his default choice. He never considered Madsen, which I kept thinking, it's not my place to tell kids where to go to high school, but come on, Uday, this would have been such a great experience for him. His reasoning, though, revealed a sense, present but not explicit, that selective enrollment schools outside of predominantly white neighborhoods were inferior and worth avoiding, even at the expense of young people's own academic opportunities. Finally, from chapter 5, I talk about Sasha, whose experiences show both how more affluent families could more powerfully help their children navigate high school admissions, and how this experience shaped her as a citizen. And I use the citizen word, given what a loaded term that is right now in the United States, a member of the Chicago community, not in terms of her immigration status. So, Sasha went to Vista Elementary School, so I'm going to refer to Vista a few times. Vista students' explicit civic education was easy to spot. It emphasized ways in which social forces shape citizenship. Vista's 8th graders read by Howard Zinn, A Young People's History of the United States. Their Chicago History Fair projects concern topics like the city's LGBTQ rights movement and the span of police authority under alcohol prohibition. 8th graders were emphatically assigned to reflect on complex civic issues, usually from a social justice perspective. At the same time, young people encountered civic lessons outside of their formal curriculum. Study participants' civic experiences of competitive choice policy conflicted with what they learned in class, in that the choice process encouraged students to act out of self-interest rather than to reflect upon or challenge the societal relationships embedded in the looking of competitive choice. Sasha assimilated these conflicting lessons, making them look like they naturally belonged together. An outgoing, biracial, high-performing student who espoused equity and community. She knew that educational opportunities were not distributed evenly across Chicago, and she was grateful to have taken advanced math at her K-8 school. I understand more of the math now than other people at my high school do. People who didn't have that much, when they could be in Algebra 2 with me, they're still in Algebra 1 because they just didn't get those opportunities in elementary school. She wished that more Chicago youth could go to schools like Perry, her academically selective high school, which boasted over 100 electives and beautiful science labs. When I was doing some research for this book, this is the school that my son kept yelling down from upstairs, "Mom, did you know this about Perry? Did you know this? Did you know they teach Arabic? Mom, did you know they have an aquaponics lab?" Sasha and her parents had long ago determined that she had to hustle to get the schooling that she needed. Actually, they had to hustle too, as you'll see. They drove her over 30 minutes each way for 9 years to avoid her neighborhood K-8 school. They readily enrolled her in weekly test preparation classes to the tune of $400 in order to boost her 7th grade standardized test scores, already thinking ahead to her applications for high school, where those test scores would make up a third of the portfolio that would be considered. In 8th grade, Sasha took another $400 course to get herself ready for the high school entrance exam. She learned in that class that the exam did not allow students to use calculators, and she got to practice answering mock test items from a test booklet without using a calculator. Other students, including many of the students who participated in the study, would only learn of that rule the day they showed up to take the exam. Opportunity to advance, Sasha learned, was something that students had to seize for themselves. Sasha felt that the CPS policy that divided open seats at academically selective and magnet high schools, ironically initially put in place to desegregate Chicago schools. Okay, let's go back. Sasha felt that the CPS policy that divided open seats at selective enrollment at magnet high schools among students by 4 socioeconomic tiers, which is where they divided up about 2/3 of the seats to these schools, divided those seats into 4 different tiers by students' census tract data for their neighborhood. So basically students who were in socioeconomically similar neighborhoods were competing against one another for seats within their tier. She felt that this policy kept opportunities away from her and other people. She told me, "I don't think it gives an equal opportunity, because I could live in tier 1, which was the lowest income tier, and not even have to get a 75% on this test. If I was in tier 4, the most affluent tier, which she was in, I'd have to get a perfect score." Compared to her, Sasha felt, tier 1 lower income students practically held the keys to the city. They can basically go anywhere, she said of tier 1 students. They don't have to try as hard as people in tier 4. I note here both, this is an 8th grader sort of repeating arguments against affirmative action as she's talking nonchalantly to me, but also that she inaccurately understood the policy, but really believed that that's what the policy said and was really pissed off about what she thought was happening. Sasha looked out for herself, since her experiences led her to conclude that neither CPS nor city leaders stood on her side. All they care about really is numbers and statistics and how well we do on this or that certain test, she insisted. She thought that Chicago's mayor should care, in her words, about the kind of education the kids are getting, and also about being able to supply learning opportunities to everyone. But, she continued, I feel like he cares more about what Chicago looks like instead of who we are and what we are. In what Sasha saw as the absence of the city's care for her, she cared for herself. She told me, I think more of my future, and then for the city's future, and then for other people's, she said nonchalantly. Her vigilance about her own educational needs seemed to preclude consideration of her civic kinfolk. When asked whether she would enroll in a hypothetical ACT prep course at her school that would be free, but that would exclude many others, she said she would, without missing a beat. That's a very selfish thing to say, she acknowledged, but just because someone else is missing out on something, if I had the opportunity, I'd still want to reach for it. I'd still want to get as much opportunities as I can, really. Sasha saw the contradictions between her beliefs and her actions. She believed in community and equity, yet she acted on her own behalf. She jokingly referred to herself as a hypocrite. She wanted all students to have the chance to go to Perry, yet she did everything she could to beat others out for her spot when the time came. She didn't question why she had to work so hard at positioning herself, or why such desirable educational goods were in such short supply in the first place. The point here isn't that Sasha and her peers' perspectives were riddled with contradictions, which they were, or that they were troubling, that too. The point here is that Sasha and her peers' experience as a competitive choice bundled together made these contradictions seem natural, not even like a contradiction at all. Their civic experiences taught them how to live as Americans in the 21st century, how to simultaneously believe in equity, defensively seize opportunities for themselves, and place full responsibility on themselves and their peers for their own success or failure. As Sasha shows, young people are powerful policy actors, and that might seem like a weird thing for me to say at this point, but I'll explain. They can do a lot to shape their own school choices, and along the way they shape others. Sasha's actions love them or hate them as we may. And the similar actions of thousands of students across Chicago contributed to citywide patterns where the highest performing students flocked to schools in predominantly white neighborhoods and avoided schools in neighborhoods of color. In spite of this power, though, Sasha, Oday, Raphael are all in an impossible situation, and they knew it. They knew the stakes were high, and they were doing everything they could about it. Eden, a brilliant young woman, who answered a question I asked her by explaining the difference between theoretical and pragmatic physics, which I had to go home and look up, whose parents were both long-term unemployed, told me, if I'm willing to kick and scream and bite the ass off of everyone around me, I have the power to get the education I want. Eden was willing to fight, and by my reckoning, she probably would have done pretty good at it. But we know what she's up against: Chicago's thick social racial geography, income inequality, and our fervent but irrational belief that people have to earn a good education if they want one. She thinks it's her responsibility to get the education that she needs. So that's what I've got for you for now. Thank you for being here. Dan Quinn from the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education is here to share some thoughts about the book, and then I'd love to hear what you all are thinking or questioning as we sort of bridge what I learned to what's happening here in Philadelphia.
Well, I want to thank you for writing this book. It was fantastic, and I devoured it. And having no experience or connection to Chicago at all, I really felt like the very detailed contextual explanations that you provide give you a good sense of what Chicago is like, number one, but number two, you also do a really nice job making connections or sort of pointing the reader to some broader kinds of generalizations for our understanding of districts that are similar to Chicago, that have some kind of competitive choice system, districts like Philadelphia, San Francisco, lots of other places as well. And so thank you, it was really good. And I'm interested to hear from you what your inspiration was. You pointed to a book on Germantown High as one of the inspirations, and what led you to write this book and focus on this aspect of competitive choice, focusing on the experiences of students and how students are navigating it? What was that inspiration?
That's an awesome question. Thank you for this kind of experience. I moved to Chicago. I lived in Chicago on and off my entire adult life, but I moved back there in 2009 to work at Loyola, and I had a 5-year-old at the time. And I was so happy to be back in an actual city after being exiled in Palo Alto for 7 years that I went to as many parks as I could. I just wanted to get my kid in city parks and get him to know this wonderful city. And parents started talking to me, like people I didn't know who they were. I mean, the people I was meeting were also doing this at, soccer games or whatever. But like people I never saw before and never saw again were saying these really intense personal things to me about where their 5-year-olds were going to go to school. Did he take the test? How did he do? We have to go to our neighborhood school. I'm going to keep trying to get him out of there. And it just really hit me like what a civic experience this was for parents, where they were feeling like really freaking pumped that their kids got to go to classical school or that they didn't and they had to go to their neighborhood school, and they were really pissed off about that. And that was really interesting to me, and it kept continuing, and people would have almost arguments about this stuff. And that's fascinating, and we are in good hands as far as people talking to parents about school choice. Right here in Philadelphia, Maya Kuchera really, wrote one of the books about parents' experiences of choice, as did Mary Patillo McCoy at Northwestern in the Chicago area. They had really handled that. And it really sort of blew my mind that we have this policy in place. This sort of gets to what you were saying before, Kathleen. Like, we've got educational researchers and educators and policymakers over here, but like, who's listening to the people who actually live out policy? And the two groups I'm really interested in are teachers and students. And no one really talks to students about their experiences of policy. You guys are in a hotbed of youth organizing here in Philadelphia. I'm a huge fan of the Philly Student Union. I was really inspired and excited to hear some of the actions that they've taken this year. But we're not reading that stuff. And my students need to read it, policymakers need to read it, so I just tried to figure out a way that I could actually hear from students and hear what they think, because that tells us what we need to know. Without that, these ideas about like the weird fit between the policy and who people are when they're 13 and 14, I wouldn't have figured that out on my own.
What has the reaction been to when you present this work to Chicago folks, district folks, and other locals?
I was lucky to get to share this with leaders at Chicago Public Schools, and they were really like unsurprised by everything. And I really like tried to deliver it in a way that didn't make them think like, I think you're horrible people, but like, here's how this is turning out. Like, you had a good idea with this system. This is after the Supreme Court forbade the assignment of students to public schools based on race, so they knew they had to come up with something different because they were going to lose their criteria and try to keep these schools at least somewhat balanced and not totally dominated by affluent white kids. They had stories for me that I hadn't heard, but it was like the placement office, the advertising, the director of advertising for Chicago Public Schools. Did you know that urban school districts had directors of advertising? I didn't. That they were really thinking about this. They were really troubled by how uneven enrollment is and how these wonderful schools were getting ignored by so many thousands of students. So the district was, I think, reinforced by this. I mean, everyone gets back to like, okay, like, yes, we know that this sort of sucks, and like, what do we do about it? The community presentations I've made, parents seem to feel reinforced. Like, this isn't good for my kid. I knew this wasn't good for my kid. I felt really bad and that I had to help them, and I knew this. Like, it's helpful to hear that. I had one mom who was just like clutching her head with her hands over her eyes where she was asking the question about what should she do because her son was going to take the test the next week. And what I'm finding is that people who are interested, for the most part, are people who are living with it one way or another, people who went through it themselves, people who are educators, people who are parents and see it coming, and then people in my, our little policy wonk world who are thinking about equity-oriented policy, which is who, the other audience I'm really hoping to talk to.
I think we really want to make this a conversation, and if folks have questions or thoughts or comments.
I was very surprised because you had said earlier that the decision who goes to what school is decided by a central office, but it seems like every school has a different application process, which seems at odds. So in Philly, the schools decide, but there was one central application for public schools, not for charter schools. And you said that the central office is very concerned about like racial equity, but this system of all these different applications I would think would privilege people. So why do they still have that system?
It's interesting. I mean, as soon as I said that to you, I was like, oh, I should have qualified that, but then it would have taken me 15 minutes to explain it, so I'll try to do it in like 30 seconds now. The Mastermans of Chicago, and there are 11 schools that are academically selected, but then there's another whole rung of these international baccalaureate programs. Those are the schools, and specialized schools like pre-law. So there is a set of schools where this office makes assignments. They just find out your test scores and your grades, and then whatever you ranked on your application, whatever of the, if you're high school, if you score into that school, you get it, and all the other schools are wiped away. So that office handles placement of the most sort of coveted competitive schools.
It's like a computer calculation.
Yeah,
or it's just sort of
like no human anything. No room, human proof, for better or for worse. But then neighborhood schools, it's sort of up to them. So that's another whole problem, right? That they can sort of decide what the criteria are. You have to use an essay, but then no one's really looking out over who they let in and not let in. How are they judging the value of those essays? What's considered a good essay or not? It also means that you get a very official sounding letter from the school that, for most kids tells them you didn't get into any of the fancy schools that you applied to, you don't get to go to Masterman. But then they might be waitlisted for all these other schools, or the schools just might not have decided yet. So that for a lot of the students in our in the study, they didn't find out for weeks, and it's this whole, I mean, just like imagine this, like it's sort of like match day for medical students or like sorority rush or something, but you're 13 and you show up to school and everybody found out, unless you live in a neighborhood where the mail delivery isn't so good, which some of our students did, and now that's very, very racialized in Chicago. So some kids didn't know they were going, and everyone comes and it's like, you know, who wants you? Oh, nobody? Oh, you don't know? So it was
What are your thoughts on this? Because I'm an educator in public schools in Atlanta.
Oh, wow.
And a friend of mine who's very, very well read, she loves to read. She has a room this size that she could fill with books, trying to get her to stop. But I told her I was coming to Philly to visit, and she follows this store and say, oh, you got to come and check it out while you're here. But we've had discussions on how desegregation was not good, because it seems like when the desegregation happened and so many people were opposed to it already, racial divide, that they took the neighborhood teachers out because a lot of them lost their jobs, and they put white teachers there who were told don't teach them but so much, and they hadn't. So this has been created from desegregation, because in the South they started having church schools right away. The church schools started there, and then homeschooling started, and it's very, very. I was surprised how huge that organization is in the South. So right now the problem is, you have a generation of parents who were not educated properly, so they're embarrassed that they cannot help their child be educated properly. So now what you have are students who are frustrated, and behavior problems are just out of control. So it's hard to teach because of all of the discipline problems that you're trying to get under control. And then the parents taking up for those kids who should be having consequences. So education should have never been created the way it's been created, because you shouldn't have to have a good school that has all of these criteria. All of them should be good schools. And so I think that one point that you made about the student body and the student unions that are now coming up in arms and talking, I feel that a stage play should happen where the students are on stage talking about this and touring this play, so that they can get people to look at and pay attention to what they're talking about.
Yeah, and that was really my hope with the book, is that seeing what this actually is for students would wake people up a little bit.
Yeah.
That when you put a policy like this in place in a hyper multi-generational segregated city, where income inequality is just soaring like it is here, there sort of isn't any way it could turn out any different. And we do, I mean, there are differences in terms of different schools' abilities to retain talented educators. And these, I mean, these schools are pretty tantalizing with, you know, your Arabic club and your aquaponics lab. And I have PhD students who are working in some of these top flight schools. I mean, like, I never had any teachers like that. It's pretty exciting.
And like you just said, it's tough, because a lot of really good teachers that are in the trenches in the low socioeconomic schools, because they're not getting the backing and support from administrators, they're leaving. Good teachers are leaving, and that's what's hurting the education system now, because they're fed up.
Well, we also, I mean, what I think is happening alongside what you've shared is that when kids sort of sniff out this pecking order, right?
Yes.
That is held up by racially uneven public transportation access, by racially uneven security and safety practices at schools. They're going where they're not going to have to deal with a bunch of mess, where they're not going to have to wait 45 minutes for the bus. But also, where people aren't going to be like, you went to Simeon, wow, why'd you have to go there? Like they know, you meet some, I mean, I'm sure, I don't know if it's this way in Philly. In Chicago, if you meet someone and they find out that you grew up in the city, they want to know where you went to high school. It's like the first question out of their mouth. And kids know this, so they're voting with their feet just as many educators are. There's a big fight that happened today in Chicago Public Schools at the board meeting about looking at how the school rating system punishes schools in racially isolated neighborhoods. Just the numbers, attendance and grades and all that, are you a 1 school or a 1+ or a 2- or whatever. These are big issues that are being talked about, but if we put kids in the situation and ask them to figure it out, beautiful, thoughtful, equity-oriented kids are doing this along with the kids who said stuff that made my skin crawl. Other questions or observations, connections to Philadelphia?
San Francisco also has a competitive choice system, and San Francisco's central or mastermind is Lowell.
Yes.
And same sort of thing where there's Lowell has all of the resources. It's got the most tenured teachers. It's got a ton of counselors, lots of language options, and then you have schools in the city that are severely under-resourced. And one argument that I heard was that maybe we should get rid of the Lowells. Like maybe if it's about making sure that every child has equal opportunity and all schools should be equally good schools, then by putting all of our resources into the one school, the Lowell, that exacerbates inequality. I think this person was sort of saying this provocatively because politically it wouldn't happen. But
That's
I wonder if people if the young people or the people at CPS or maybe here in Philadelphia have thought about that. What would it mean to really equalize schools, and would it mean maybe getting rid of the selective schools? Is selective having no selective enrollment schools an answer? Or is there a way to maintain equal educational opportunity and still have really good schools and outstanding schools?